So Ernst van Zyl is, of course, a prominent land thief in South Africa, an Afriforum campaign officer. Conscious Caracal, not Carousel. I made that mistake the last time around. And he's behind the documentary Selfbestuur, Staatsbestande, oplossings vir die toekoms. So, Ernst, tell me about this documentary. I think you start with the terms federalism and centralism. What is that about?
So yeah, thank you for inviting me on the show, Donald. And yeah, when it comes to the themes of the documentary, it all starts off with the foundation or the bedrock of the titanic battle between two models of governance, or two models of influencing reality. And those two models are centralism and federalism. And centralism, best example is the ANC. The ANC government's a heavily centralized government with, for example, a monopoly like Eskom, Transnet, all these SOEs. The ANC, if you were to give them a perfect world, and you could, if they could script their perfect country, they would have a country where the state controls every facet, where there's no room for any private initiative or anything, where communities take anything into their own hands. The state would be handling everything. But now we're sitting with a state that's incompetent, and they can't and corrupt at the same time. So they can't meet all these responsibilities that they've taken upon themselves to do. They can't. The other thing on the other side of that is federalism. It's the idea that the smallest social unit should take on as many responsibilities as possible, not just should be able to as well. So that example of that would be, if a town can generate its own electricity, it should be able to, and it should take up the responsibility. It has a duty to do it, rather than being tied to a failing monopoly like Eskom. That's the basic gist of it.
And as far as I know, you didn't make a mention of confederacy in the documentary. Why is that? Is federalism the broad concept? Is there two different interpretations of federalism? Because you also referred to Switzerland as a federalist society. Isn't it a confederacy?
I'm not too familiar with that term. So for me, it's pretty much the focus on the federal idea. I think confederacy falls under, it's a form of federalism. I think federalism is more the broad term, and seeing as what we're focusing on is community federalism, which is also a sub term below the big umbrella term of federalism. Our model is specifically built on communities taking all these responsibilities into their own hands. So as I understand it, confederalism would be just another type of federalism that falls under that label.
And Ernst, tell us about South Tyrol. I think it's Tyrol. Perhaps, okay, you'd probably speak about it best. What's the story there?
So we wanted to incorporate South Tyrol into the documentary because it's such a fascinating case that shows you a lot of the principles in action that we are trying to replicate with our model as well. So South Tyrol is a province in Italy that is semi-autonomous. It has a very interesting history where it used to be part of Austria, and then after the First World War, because Italy fought on the side of the Allies, they got this very rich province from Austria, who was allied with Germany, as almost like some spoils of war. But the thing is, this province was vast majority Austrian, not Italian. So what you have here is an Austrian minority now within the central state of Italy, where they're a super minority. I think today they are about 1.3% of the entire population. But through a long, almost 100-year struggle, they were able to carve out an autonomous or semi-autonomous province for themselves, where they can keep 90% of their income, and also not just 90% of their income that they can spend how they want. They have control over sectors like education, over monuments, and over cultural infrastructure. Many other things concerning the specific province they can take into their own hands and manage themselves. And this comes from a very brutal history that they had to survive first. So when they became part of Italy, and then in the 1920s, when Mussolini came to power, he set out, and the Italian government set out on a very merciless and ruthless Italianization project of South Tyrol to basically assimilate them into the bigger Italy. So German schools were banned. The German language was pushed out and marginalized from public spaces. People had to change their German names and surnames to Italian names and surnames. German place names and street names were changed to Italian names, like cities and streets.
That sounds familiar.
Also, that sounds familiar. And then also many other policies, like, for example, the Italian government flooding South Tyrol with Italians semi-migrating from the Italian part of Italy to South Tyrol through, for example, housing schemes and factories that have employment plans where Italians are hired specifically, almost like Italian economic empowerment, where you pretty much demographically try to transform South Tyrol into an Italian province and Italianize it in order to control it in the end. So they have a fascinating history of what they had to overcome, and in the end, we thought it was very apt to include them in the documentary, seeing as there's an organization there called the Friends of the Afrikaner, that have been building up ties between the Afrikaners here in South Africa and the South Tyroleans, because we share a very similar history as well, seeing as they were invaded by Napoleon and his imperial forces in the 1800s, and they also, just a band of farmers, resisted. So there's a very strong and growing relationship between the South Tyroleans and the Afrikaners, and they're fascinated with what's going on here.
I don't understand Napoleon. How is that connected with the Afrikaners?
Because it's in the exact same way as the British Empire invaded South Africa and tried to imperial might tried to swallow up a very small republic or republics. You also get in the South Tyrolean history Napoleon and his imperial empire trying to take them over, and they also just regular farmers and people without military training resisting this imperial force. So they see a lot of similarities there between the two, and also South Tyroleans sent support to the Boers in the Anglo-Boer War as well.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. And but it seems to me that South Tyrol would be like the best example. But in South Africa, we have the problem. If you want Afrikaners to secede or become get self-determination in one spot, they're very spread out in South Africa. I mean, Afrikaners and Gauteng, Western Cape, all over the place. So it seems to me that's the problem here in South Africa. How do we overcome that if that's your goal, to get one culture group in one area?
Yeah, no, so that is the central problem that you describe there, is that Afrikaners' big challenge is not on numbers. There's between 2.5 and 3 million Afrikaners in South Africa. I mean, that's larger than the population of many countries. But our big problem is that we are very dispersed over this massive territory, which means that everywhere we are a very small minority. But where you start concentrating, where Afrikaners start living together and closer together, there you can start influencing reality around you and start really exerting influence on the area around you. So when it comes to specifically the strategies that we are going to implement to make that easier, there are two types of strategies. There's never going to just be one. It's good to have a wide range of strategies to employ. So the first one is the Afriforum and Solidarity Movement's anchor towns or anchor communities strategy, where we identify towns or areas or parts of cities all across the country where Afrikaners are already living in high concentrations and in high numbers. And then those places we will help develop and make sure that they have Afrikaans schools, Afrikaans churches, that there are security structures there and more. But and we mobilize those of our over 155 branches that fall within those areas. We mobilize them to facilitate this as well.
Sorry,
this will mean that
just out of curiosity, how do you determine if something's Afrikaans? If this is Afrikaans community? How does Afriforum go about doing that?
How's an Afrikaner community? Because there are people that identify as Afrikaners. It's one of those things where it's not some mathematical equation where if you reach a certain threshold, then you qualify as an Afrikaner. It's one of those things where I mean, that's where identity comes in. A Jew knows he's a Jew. Afrikaner knows he's an Afrikaner. It's something that it's a self-identifying thing that comes from almost an intuition. It's not something where you have to fill in a form, and if you score 7 out of 10, then you can qualify as an Afrikaner.
Okay, yeah, I understand that point, but how does Afriforum go about doing it? So what you're sort of describing is something subjective. It seems to me Afriforum has to have an objective way of determining
this. Well, not Afriforum, specifically the Solidarity Research Institute does all this demographic research, and then we base our model on that, on their methodology and on their research.
And what would be some of these anchor communities, just around South Africa, out of curiosity?
So some of them would be, let me just remember, I think the best example would be Urania. Another one would be Die Moot in Pretoria. There's, I think 14 anchor communities potential anchor communities in Pretoria alone. Then also you have, I think Mossel, George is one of them as well in the Cape. There is, I have to remember what's some of the other ones. I have to go check, Don. I don't have all of the top of my head. It's not my main field of focus.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. No, that was just the names you mentioned already illuminates the amount of communities there are. And it makes sense, like George, for example. And is there a plan to connect these towns, these anchor communities, in some way?
That's in the end. You can't just have these anchor communities. They will have to be connected in a certain way. And the good advantage of many of them that are in close proximity, like in Pretoria, means that they can be much easily connected, and then there will be increasing cooperation between them, and you actually create this massive network where they can start supporting each other through whatever they need.
And that will be, for example, via trains. Do you have a plan for like a train system, railways?
No, this is where these types of solutions come in. I mean, let's be honest, we're not playing an RTS game. It's not like where you click on a map and then it constructs a train station, or you drag your mouse and it just constructs a rail network. These are things that you build brick by brick from a very small and humble beginning. It's the problem with any type of thinking along this direction, is you quickly start thinking about things very far down the line, like what's our flag going to look like, what's our anthem going to look like, how are we going to build a train system, how are we going to do X, Y, and Z. But you're not answering the simple question of how am I going to make sure every one of these communities has a neighborhood watch? How am I going to make sure every one of these communities has water? How am I going to make sure every one of these communities can become increasingly state-proof against Eskom and load shedding? How am I going to make sure that the Afrikaans schools in these communities continue to be Afrikaans and are able to give good quality education? These are the central things that you have to figure out first before you can start thinking about, well, now we're going to connect them with a railroad, or now we're going to start building X, Y, or Z. Your big focus at this point, and what Afriforum is focusing on, is the basics of building order, or oases of order in a desert of disorder, as Professor Koos Malan puts it, but slowly but surely. And as I was raised, I mean, as you do not do it reg. If you're going to do something, you better do it right. So, and doing it right means building it slow and steady, not something that you just plop down, like I said, well, like playing a video game. In reality, Rome is slowly built brick by brick, day by day. And you start by building small institutions and you expand them bigger. Small. You start by building or establishing a very small circle of influence and order, and you expand that circle slowly but surely, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers at a time. And then you build sustainable. That's how you build sustainable centers of order that will last into the future, rather than quickly setting up something in a rush and it falls apart before it's even completed.
You mentioned RTS games. Have you played the latest Age of Empires?
No, I haven't. I don't have a lot of time to play games these days.
That's a pity. You should. It's very good. Okay, Western Cape. I think this is one of the center of Afriforum's attention. I mean, devolving powers to the Western Cape. What's the process there? I mean, the Western Cape Devolution Working Group. What's happening, and do you see progress there?
So what we're doing there with the Western Cape is, firstly, the biggest task is that you have to make sure that the Kaapenaars, or the people living in the Western Cape, realize that there is something that needs to be done. That's the biggest problem, or the biggest obstacle to overcome. Many people that live in the Cape, because the future hasn't happened there yet, as Flabay says, thinks that everything is fine. Oh, it could never happen here. That's almost like a Cape Townian proverb at this point. But that's the first step. The second step is to work with, firstly, lobby and pressure local government to take more and more control over basic services like electricity, water, policing. That's going to take time, and it's also going to depend on the willingness and will of the local government. But you can't depend completely on party politics to determine your future. So the other thing is then putting more resources into establishing functional and effective neighborhood watches in all of these towns where a lot of Afrikaners are and Afriforum members are concentrated. Also making sure that these towns have functioning Afriforum branches, making sure that all of these nodes and all of these centers of order that we're establishing, from small to big, that they are equipped for the future that is coming, because the future waits for no man. And when it comes to the Western Cape, people better start organizing. You can't wait for, as Russell Lamberti says in the documentary, nobody's going to give you a lovely political order. You better build it, and you better start doing your part to build it. Just marking your little X on a piece of paper and standing in line for 15 minutes is really not, it doesn't even register on the scale of a sacrifice. I mean, you're going to have to start getting involved. You're going to have to identify a neighborhood watch close to you, a community-based organization close to you, and get involved. Put up your name there, give them your time, give them your support. And that's the thing that already has been happening for a long time in Pretoria and in Gauteng and in the Free State and many of these other provinces. But in the Western Cape, it is starting to build momentum, but there's a lot that still needs to be done. And people have to understand that, and this is the main message of the documentary, is that it isn't enough to just support initiatives on social media. If you really want to see a change and want to empower these organizations, and there are many organizations making a big difference, you are going to have to become physically involved with the actions and with the initiatives of those organizations and centers of order near you. You can't just help out by liking their post on Facebook. I mean, you're going to have to start, if you really want to see a difference, you're going to have to start getting your hands dirty and rolling up your sleeves. It's a very difficult message to sell, because everyone wants to hear, don't worry about it, there's this big strong organization that's going to fix everything, you just sit back and relax, nothing is expected from you. That's like selling candy to people. Our message is like selling vegetables to people, selling them medicine, the thing that they need but that doesn't taste nice.